Good afternoon, everybody. I'm wanting to start the lecture and give a very brief recap for the benefit of people who are joining us today. The first lecture was defining a very strange subject, looking at a general kind of history of how people have thought about the emotions, particularly in Western civilization. I'm afraid the Far East is being shortchanged. I have said very little about Japan and China, but I was giving a general survey of the thinking about the emotions on Monday, and the hero of the lecture was Charles Darwin, who wanted, in his famous late book on the expression of the emotions in man and animals, to see the emotions in the context of nature, and argue that emotions were hardwired into animals and humans as means of coping with the environment, various kinds of hazards in the environment, so that there's the fight and flight response, and there is the shame response, and which is based on blushing. And there is the disgust response, whose function is to protect one against decaying food and poisons. So there is this approach which is basically evolutionary, but it's also clear that nature is subject to considerable revision at the hands of human culture, and there are all sorts of strange things which culture builds on the basis of our basic animal nature. And the second lecture was looking at the, starting to look at shame rather than disgust. And there the hero was Erik Erikson, the psychoanalyst, who related shame to questions about the identity crisis and the integrity crisis. And yesterday I was looking at the work of the anthropologists and the historians who've been inspired by the anthropologists on the great Mediterranean honor and shame complex, which persists to this day in various Mediterranean countries, although it's not quite as intense as it once was. It's been subject to kind of social change and social pressure, although I think not as much as in Northern Europe, where Protestantism had a very radical effect. And I also looked at the end at Africa, a wonderful book by John Iliff, which imaginatively looks at the pre-colonial societies, many of which were warrior societies and had a kind of honor and shame culture rather similar to that of the Mediterranean peoples. And then the effects of colonialism, which in some respects repressed the old fighting culture, and then post-colonialism. And the book is splendidly imaginative because of looking at the honor of women in a way which I think earlier writers had not done, and carrying things right up to date, looking at questions of shame in relation to the struggle with HIV/AIDS. There being, of course, huge levels of shame associated with being HIV positive, and this making it very difficult to combat AIDS in Africa. So that was a sort of grand tour of the Mediterranean and Africa with a few words about Northern Europe yesterday. Today I'm going to move on, and the topics for the lecture today are ressentiment, nationalism, xenophobia, and populism. This is not quite the list of titles I had in my original plan for this lecture, so I've got to make a slight apology. I had originally wanted to discuss the role of the world religions in today's lecture, but for various reasons I found it better to try and move that material into other lectures, into yesterday's lecture when we were talking about the decline of the honor and shame culture, where both Islam and Christianity tried to suppress the honor and shame culture, Christianity rather more successfully than Islam. And it's also in tomorrow's lecture when I'm talking about the guilt culture, which was a major development in the early modern period in Europe, particularly in Catholicism. So today I have decided that I'm not going to actually talk so much about the world religions. There are some other exclusions, and these were made early on. I knew I had to exclude the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, partly because the subject is so rich, and partly because I've treated it in summer school lectures in other years. My course last year was on anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And I've had to make further exclusions. I'm not going to talk about the rage of revolutionary mobs in the French and Russian revolutions, or about lynch mobs in the Old South, and other forms of hatred directed against the other. This is partly in order to keep the subject manageable, and also because I'm trying to focus narrowly on the phenomena associated with the emotion of shame. Shame is, in some sense, the most mysterious of the emotions. It's easy to understand fear, and I think it probably isn't too difficult to understand rage, but shame, that peculiar self-consciousness in the presence of other people, does require careful handling and elaborate handling, and there is interesting material about it. And it is related to all these other important social phenomena like xenophobia and chauvinism, which I'm going to talk about today. And I wanted to say a few words about the current new horror, which is populism. I thought, just to be topical, I must say something about populism, although that also is a very broad subject and will take us beyond talking about shame. There was one other thing which I wanted to mention, and I need to go back because it was a slide I didn't show yesterday, in relation to the contribution made by Christianity in suppressing the old pagan concepts of honor and shame and the family kind of centered values which were associated with Greece and Rome. And I have a wonderful illustration for this, which is a Bernini statue of Aeneas carrying his father Anchises, followed by his son Ascanius. This is the earliest great masterpiece by Bernini. It's in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, but most people don't notice it because usually when you go to the Galleria Borghese, you're hurrying to get on to the next room where the wonderful Apollo and Daphne is located, which is not just Bernini's first masterpiece, but one of the greatest masterpieces of sculpture ever made. So most people don't see this extraordinary statue, which is wonderfully historically correct. The Renaissance, in many ways, as I mentioned the other day, was not just a revival of antiquity, it was also a critique of antiquity. And they didn't always get the history right. So that what's extraordinary is that Bernini did get the history right. I think he must have consulted some sort of learned humanist, because this statue is difficult for the modern person to read. You've got to ask yourself, what are the three men doing? Well, Aeneas is fleeing the sack of his home city, carrying his father on over a shoulder. But what is his father Anchises carrying? He's carrying a tiny little thing which I think is difficult to see in the slide, and I'm not sure I could have done better about that. This is the best slide I could find, picture I could find. He's actually carrying what are called the penates, the image of the domestic gods, which always stood next to the family hearth in the classical Roman home. And Ascanius is carrying the hearth itself. And this is a very strange set of customs which was found in both Greece and Rome, whereby the hearth was the center of the home, and normally an eternal flame was kept burning on the hearth. And it was regarded as terrible bad luck for the family if the flame was allowed to go out. So there was this duty of tending the flame. And this, I think, symbolizes a great deal about the personal religion of the Greeks and the Romans, which was very much centered on the family. We know that there are religions today which are centered on the family. Judaism, of course, requires the father to preside and say the blessing at the Friday night supper. But the role of the Jewish father is much reduced in comparison with the Roman paterfamilias, because the paterfamilias in ancient Rome had the power of life and death over his wife, his children, and his slaves. And it was absolutely kind of normal for this to be exercised. In particular, whenever the wife gave birth, she would be somewhere in the back room with the midwife. And when the child was finally out, the midwife would bring the child to the father, waiting impatiently in the front room, and he would inspect the child to see if it was healthy and if he wanted to recognize it as his own. And if he did, he would hold it up. But if he didn't, he would drop it. And it would then be taken out and thrown into the gutter. So that you have this terrific kind of wastage of children in ancient Rome, with the father exercising his power of life and death over the child. So now Christianity couldn't bear this. In fact, Judaism couldn't bear this. There are kind of Roman ethnographers who say, one of the strange things about the Jews is they love all their children. But Christianity kind of rejected this and created foundling homes for children who were abandoned from an early age. And it rejected the cult of the family hearth, and so it shut down this sort of religion. And that is one of the key ways in which it kind of undermined the cult of the honor and shame, which was very much associated with the lineages. Once you got a situation where people were treated as individuals rather than members of families, once you got a situation where children in particular could go into the church rather than stay under the domination of the paterfamilias, you move towards a more egalitarian society. And this is terribly important in understanding the role of religion in undermining the honor and shame complex in the ancient Mediterranean. Okay, so that was what I should have said yesterday, but had other things on my mind. So let's go forward into today's lecture, and I want to start by saying something about ressentiment. This is a rather peculiar kind of notion. It comes from the noted German philosopher and cultural critic Friedrich Nietzsche, who drew attention to a particular kind of envy and hatred, or envy and malice, which he called ressentiment. This is just actually the ordinary French word for resentment, but he kind of used it in preference to using a German word, and he used it in a special sense which has stayed with it since, and it's the kind of hatred which mediocrities feel towards persons of superior achievement. It is usually based, of course, on some sense of shame. If one feels inadequate, one of the ways of coping with that situation is by hating the person who makes you feel inadequate. Nietzsche saw this kind of resentment, ressentiment, as characteristic of what he called the slave mentality. And you must remember, of course, he was an extreme right-winger in some sense. He disapproved of democracy. He was an elitist. He thought that the supreme aim of civilization should be to produce superior types, the so-called supermen. And he felt that the consequence of ressentiment was a kind of leveling down which would prevent the emergence of supermen. And of course, this goes, as I said, together with a certain kind of hatred for or contempt for democracy. Nietzsche was fairly kind of clear about his preference for a hierarchical society based on achievement. Now, I think that we want to sort of separate some things out here. Nietzsche was correct, I think, to diagnose this as a kind of a recurrent sort of psychology based on shame and hatred, but we don't have to follow him in assuming that democracy and the desire for equality kind of go with this or derive from this. So what I'm wanting to suggest is that one needs actually to bear in mind the wonderful words in the funeral oration delivered by Pericles in Thucydides, where he describes the greatness of the Athenians and the greatness of the Athenian democracy as including the fact that we give people their due. We recognize talent. And it is, or can be, under those circumstances, in fact, an egalitarian sentiment, because we recognize that everybody has the possibility of achieving, and of course, achieving in many different ways, and so there are many different kinds of excellence. And a society which was trying to enforce mediocrity would, of course, be a highly undemocratic society. And there's all sorts of ironies here, as I sort of mentioned at the bottom of the slide. Many of Nietzsche's 20th century followers themselves seem to suffer from ressentiment. The extraordinary band of misfits who joined the fascist party in Italy after World War I, the strange entourage of Hitler in the 1930s included a large number of people who were kind of failures and mediocrities, and who displayed intense resentment against people like Einstein, or for that matter, some of the great artists. Part of that hatred for degenerate art is actually coming from artists who were kind of mediocre followers of the old academies. So there's a huge irony there. Nietzsche's many admirers in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany were themselves consumed with ressentiment. I mention ressentiment because it's one of the kind of important special cases of the negative emotions which we will be encountering again. But today I want to concentrate, my main subject today is about nationalism and chauvinism. By far the most powerful shame-based force during the last 2 centuries in world history has been nationalism, which has often been based on the sense of national humiliation. This is a subject which again was for a long time sort of obscured. There was a whole lot of idealism in the early 20th century among people who thought that cosmopolitanism was the right way to go. So we had idealistic supporters of the League of Nations who thought that nationalism was something disgraceful, and the less you talked about it, the better. And then, of course, we had the hyper-nationalism associated with fascism and Nazism, and that rather put a damper on kind of enthusiasm for moderate nationalism. But once we moved into the 60s with decolonization, nationalism kind of came back and was kind of acceptable or was idealized by Western enthusiasts for third world liberation. But the crucial point really was this, that because nationalism was regarded as an atavistic kind of backward-looking kind of ism in comparison with socialism, for example, there was very little academic study of it. And this was something which, like the study of honor in the 1950s, came through in the post-war period. And it came through as a result of a very important book, Ili Kaduri, Nationalism, which came out in 1960. But the most important person to write about it was the sociologist Ernest Gellner. And I've got there on the slide a picture of him sitting in his office, characteristically sort of leaning back and discussing things. There's one of his books on nationalism. He wrote, I think, something like 5 books on nationalism, all in all. The earliest one I have with me, it's called Thought and Change. This was written in response to Kaduri's book, Nationalism. Now, I should say something about the controversy between Gellner and Kaduri before moving on to the analysis which Gellner developed. And the opening paragraph of Kaduri's book is famous because of its kind of skepticism towards something which was many people regarded as so much a part of the furniture of the world that it didn't need discussion. He says, nationalism is a doctrine invented in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. It pretends to supply a criterion for the determination of the unit of population proper to enjoy a government exclusively its own, for the legitimate exercise of power in the state, and for the right organization of the society of states. Briefly, the doctrine holds that humanity is naturally divided into nations, that nations are known by certain characteristics which can be definitely ascertained, and that the only legitimate type of government is national self-government. Not the least triumph of this doctrine is that such propositions have been accepted and are thought to be self-evident, that so much so that the very word nation has been endowed by nationalism with a meaning and a resonance which, until the end of the 18th century, it was far from having. These ideas have become firmly naturalized in the political rhetoric of the West, which has taken over for the use of the whole world. But what now seems natural once was unfamiliar, needing argument, persuasion, evidence of many kinds. What seems simple and transparent is really obscure and contrived, the outcome of circumstances now forgotten and preoccupations now academic. The crucial point to make, really, I guess, is that until the end of the 18th century, one had the bulk of the governments of the world being carried out by kings and princes and bishops and similar people who in many cases spoke a language or practiced a religion or had a culture quite different from the people they ruled over. And the achievement of nationalism was to make people feel that this was unnatural, that you needed to have a people's monarchy if you were going to keep on royalty, as they did in England, or you needed to redraw the boundaries of the state so that one had the linguistic boundaries coinciding with the state boundaries. And of course that sometimes was impossible, and so there's a sort of general conviction among the purists of nationalism that countries like Belgium should not exist, or Canada not exist, or that the United States and England should be one country because they speak the same language. So nationalism is this doctrine and this extraordinary set of ideas which go with it, and as Kaduri correctly pointed out, this is all contingent. And not only is it contingent, but efforts to try and implement nationalism in terms of redrawing boundaries and moving peoples generally result in mayhem and chaos. And at the end of the First World War, the Versailles Settlement allegedly recognized the nationality principle, but when they actually looked at the map, they found that the number of Europeans who were living in a country of different culture to themselves, the number of minorities in Europe was vast. Many, many millions. Their numbers have been tossed around. 30 million, 35 million is often one estimate. But the simple idea of making the boundaries correspond with linguistic boundaries just didn't work, and attempts to make it work resulted in massive dislocation and ethnic cleansing. So, now Gellner was the person who responded to Kaduri, because Kaduri's account is an intellectualistic account. It's an account of a doctrine. of a set of ideas propagated by intellectuals, and Kaduri tends to blame German idealistic philosophy for the ideas involved in nationalism, which seems very strange. I should say a little bit more about Kaduri, whom I knew. He came out to South Africa on 2 occasions, and I got him to autograph my copy of his book. He was a remarkable man. He was a Baghdadi Jew. He'd come from that extraordinary community which was destroyed in the 1950s by the takeover of Iraq, ultimately by Saddam Hussein, but there was a predecessor whose name I've forgotten. He had suffered personally at the hand of the nationalists, and he was anything but complacent on the subject of nationalism, whereas Ernest Gellner had been somewhat complacent before he was jolted by Kaduri's book. And he subsequently said it was like the famous remark made by Immanuel Kant that it had required David Hume to awake him from his dogmatic slumbers. So Gellner thought that he had experienced dogmatic slumbers until he was jolted by Kaduri. But Kaduri's approach, as I said, is intellectualistic, not sociological, and Gellner was professor of sociology and philosophy at the London School of Economics, and so was determined to provide some sort of sociological explanation. And the first treatment in the book Thought and Change is kind of remarkable. It was also one of the books which was great for me growing up. It interprets nationalism as being the artificial creation of certain elites, usually certain bourgeois elites, who try to cobble together a state for purposes of industrial development. This may sound a little strange, but Gellner was a Jew from Prague, and that had actually been the history of the Czech state, that the Czech nationalists in the 19th century had been very concerned to build up industry and to recruit the peasants to come and work in the factories. And under those circumstances, it was necessary that the peasants should be able to read instructions in the handbook and follow the demands of the bosses, and so language was an important kind of issue for industrialization. So his argument in Thought and Change was that nationalism was a kind of artificial modern creation. There was nothing automatic about what happened when you made the transition from feudalism, the feudal society being characteristically one where the aristocracy spoke a different language from the peasants. It was important for purposes of industrial development that people should be on the same page, and therefore culture was used as a method for mobilizing the masses. Now, various people criticized this account, and it's very interesting to see how the theory evolves over a number of books. And in the final treatment, these kind of modernizing, mobilizing elites are still there, but a much more important role is played by the psychology of nationalism, which is often the psychology of national humiliation. In the final treatment, Gellner moved away from laying emphasis on the bourgeois elites who were trying to create an industrial society to lay emphasis on the masses and their sense of humiliation at the hands of alien rulers. And he has these very nice little stories which he tells, again, I think some of them based on the accounts of people he spoke to when he was growing up in the Czech lands before World War II, where people would have to wait in line in a bureaucratic office and would eventually reach the front of the queue, only to find that the bureaucrats did not even speak the local language. So there are these kind of examples of humiliation. And again, this is a sociological explanation, not just a question of individual psychology. So these have got to be stories which apply broadly in many, many situations to many, many people, and you've got to allow for individual variation. And he has a number of these stories, all of them stressing the fact that nationalism was not just about state building on the part of an elite. It was also about the sufferings and the humiliations of ordinary people, either faced with a traditional society, a feudal society which was collapsing, or a modern society which was being mobilized, as modern societies are apt to be, through processes of legal development and bureaucratization. So these are the kind of issues which he concentrated on in his final treatment. And when you look at it this way, it is absolutely clear that nationalism can be deeply dysfunctional. Because you can have people's bitterness, suffering, resentment, ressentiment being mobilized in this situation, and being mobilized against foreigners. It's not for nothing that nationalism fell under a cloud in the 1930s. Nationalism very often was chauvinism, very often was associated with xenophobia and hatred of foreigners. And of course, it led to those kind of terrible crises of ethnic cleansing after World War I and again after World War II. We have tended to forget about the tremendous number of Germans who were expelled from Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. One of we all remember the terrible figures about the Holocaust, but how many people know that more than 1 million Germans lost their lives on the passage back from the Soviet Union to Germany when they passed through Poland? Again, one of the great atrocities which has not been remembered. So, this is the question of nationalism, and it's related to another set of important circumstances connected with colonialism. As I say in this slide, both colonialism and anti-colonialism could be motivated by the need to reverse humiliation. And I have a very striking example of this, namely the French colonization of Algeria. On the left, you see a representation of the key incident in 1827, when the French consul is insulted by the Dey of Algiers, who slaps him with a fly whisk. And this particular blow turned out to be very costly for the Algerians, because it was a wound to France's national pride which had to be avenged. And so in 1830, after an intense blockade, French armies kind of came in and conquered Algeria, or at any rate, the coastal regions of Algeria. The final pacification of Algeria took most of the 19th century, and it was accomplished by the army. The army was the main instrument of colonization in the Algerian case, and it was, again, motivated by a whole set of, to us, strange and bizarre concepts and attitudes. The army of the 1820s was different from the revolutionary army of the 1790s, and different from the Napoleonic armies. The Napoleonic armies had achieved a great success by going to Egypt in a strange attempt to kind of attack the British in India. So the royalist armies after the Restoration had the feeling that they were inferior because they hadn't had success against a Middle Eastern people the way Napoleon had had. So again, we have this ressentiment, the feeling of inferiority, which needs to be avenged. And so the diplomatic humiliation of France by the Day of Algiers, with the French consul being slapped with a fly whisk, is followed by the army, the royalist army, determined to take a stand not merely against the Algerians, but also in relation to their predecessors, in relation to the royalists, to the Republican armies and the imperial armies of Napoleon. And the resistance put up by the Algerians through the 19th century is repeatedly met with efforts at pacification by the army. The governors of Algeria again and again are military men. Absolutely extraordinary, horrible story. In some sense, you can say this is feudalism. You can say this is feudal concepts of honor, which were driving the army in its colonization of Algeria. And then, of course, after 1870, we start having the coming of settlers, including, of course, the people who were exiled as a result of the Paris Commune uprising in the middle of the Franco-Prussian War. And the colonists, of course, wanted to seize the best land, and so there's a whole other story about the mistreatment of the Algerians by the French. However, one also, on the other side of the balance, needs to say that some of the things the French introduced were good, and there was some loyalty. There were people who continued to support the French right the way through till the bitter end, even though they were Muslims and native Algerians. But in the 1950s, in that world where the post-war situation of colonialism is being questioned, the Indonesians rising against the Dutch, all these people in what came to be called the Third World, the Bandung Conference, which saw India and Russia getting together to try and organize an anti-Western or an anti-colonial bloc. The Algerians saw their chance, and of course there was this terrific anti-colonial uprising. Again, one of the most terrible wars under modern conditions. A horrible picture there I show you on the right, with tanks in Algeria, and I had a choice of horrors to show you here. I, in the end, decided against showing you French soldiers marching around with human heads hanging from their hands and belts. But it was an incredibly bitter war, not least, of course, because it ended up as a war between the French and the French, with de Gaulle wanting to kind of free Algeria, but the army, who regarded Algeria as their own special fief, determined to stay on and to resist, even if it meant engaging in terrorism of their own towards de Gaulle and towards the inhabitants of mainland France who supported de Gaulle. Terrible, terrible business. And during that period, and this, of course, is why I want to mention anti-colonialism as sometimes being motivated by shame. By far and away, the most powerful recruiting slogans for the FLN, the French, the National Liberation Movement in Algeria, were slogans about France having raped the honor of Algeria, about depriving Algerian men of their manhood, of it being important for Algerians to stand up and not live a life on their knees. So the rhetoric is certainly very strongly motivated by shame. So that's the reason why colonialism and anti-colonialism are here. And of course, it's an anti-colonial nationalist movement. And in the long run, of course, it has very terrible consequences of another kind, because it was the Algerian army which came to power in an independent Algeria, not a kind of socialist democratic movement, and the army ruled with force and wasted its opportunities, wasted the money available from oil, got involved, mired in corruption, and behaved so badly. They had a brief kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, flirtation with Thatcherism and neoliberalism, but that just made the indignation of the mullahs, the Muslim fundamentalists, even greater. The thought that there were these luxury shopping complexes which ordinary Algerians could not enter was a major recruitment slogan for the FIS, the Algerian fundamentalist movement. So the history of Algeria from start to finish, from 1827 down to today, is a history of one disaster, one massacre, one terrible humiliation after another. So that is my take on colonialism and anti-colonialism. But we're not finished with the supping on horrors. I also want to mention in this context xenophobic violence. And this is something which we have seen also in South Africa in recent years. Hatred of foreigners. It's all over the world, and in fact, again, interesting questions about why it declined in Europe when it declined. You'll find that Shakespeare was concerned with anti-French violence. His landlord was a Frenchman living in the East End of London, so there was hatred of foreigners among the English, but gradually that changed, and again there seems to be some sort of process involved. As you get commercial development, people become more tolerant and more ready to engage with foreigners. So both England and Holland were early pioneers of tolerance and early pioneers of capitalism. But we've seen xenophobic violence break out in our own country, and the best analysis is due to the German sociologist Heribert Adam, who's now a Canadian citizen, and his wife Cogila Moodley. And again, I'm afraid I probably ought to have one of those frank confessions and say they are both friends of mine. And their book, Imagined Liberation, is one of the best analyses, if not the best analysis, of the subject of xenophobic violence. It's based on attitudes, interviews to assess attitudes to foreigners in 3 countries, Canada, Germany, and South Africa. At the launch of the book, there you see Heribert on the left and Cogila in the middle, and the poet Brayton Breitenbach, who did the launch in my slide on the left. Well, it's a splendid book, not least because of its bucking the trend. The trend before Heribert and Cogila wrote on the subject was to want to explain things in terms of deprivation, in terms of saying that foreigners are kind of taking the best jobs or forcing people to compete and putting pressure on wages, all those kind of economic explanations. But the analysis of Heribert and Cogila, on the contrary, rejects all that, saying that in many cases the people who launched the attacks on the spaza shops are not themselves owners of spaza shops, or even hired by owners of spaza shops. It's a question of there being kind of psychological pressure quite apart from economic pressure. And the psychological pressure is precisely, again, very often this thing about ressentiment. The conviction that foreigners are better than us because they are better businessmen, or because they manage to kind of organize things in a way which we can't, and they show up our inadequacies. So the argument ultimately is that xenophobic violence is an attempt to reverse humiliation at the hands of foreigners. And there's some quite remarkable accounts of this, or getting the attitudes of school children in particular towards foreigners in the interviews and in the questionnaires which they handed out. So I find the explanation convincing, and I think it's also convincing if one realizes that the number of people who are insulted by foreigners is actually much, much greater than the number of people who are injured by foreigners. Foreigners, particularly if they are good businessmen, tend to create business. They tend to create employment. They tend to create services and make all sorts of things available which are not otherwise available. So the issue here is one about insult rather than injury. And of course there are potentially many, many people who are insulted by the achievements of foreigners. There's also a marvelous, I should mention in passing, fieldwork done by Johnny Steinberg, who goes around interviewing people and hears about, gets stories from the Somali traders, how these township youth come into the shop and kind of ask for one impossible thing after another, or ask for possible things but turn them down every time, just in order to annoy and humiliate the trader. So I find this kind of analysis very impressive and important. And I have used it myself on a number of occasions when trying to analyze campus violence. So, this is xenophobia. But the lecture would not be complete without mentioning populism. And the best analysis of populism is also due to a German academic, Werner MUELLER, who is a professor of politics at Princeton. And I should say that populism is a much broader concept than the kinds of things I've been looking at, ressentiment and nationalism, chauvinism and xenophobia. It takes many forms. The crucial thing really about populism is the populist is a person who has a very simple narrative or has a preference for very simple narratives about politics. And so is quite ready to join in a xenophobic narrative that it's all the fault of foreigners, or it's all the fault of the Jews, and of course having a kind of simple concept. This is the other side of it. The assumption is that what needs to be done is simple and obvious. And any right-thinking person would join with the populists in doing what they're doing. And so the populists tend to regard themselves as being we the people. We the people. Even when they are a tiny minority. This is the most characteristic feature of populism, and it leads to a kind of intolerance of people who disagree. It leads to conspiracy thinking. There must be a conspiracy against us if we're not getting things coming out the way we want. And it can go with all these other things, a ressentiment of the kind I've already been talking about. One finds it very strikingly in both the case of Brexit and of Trump. Brexit, the main issue being the attitude towards foreigners, the free immigration associated with the European Union. And in Trump's case, well, there's some extraordinary things Trump says. He says things like, the most important thing is the unification of the people. The other people don't matter. And that is one of the most sort of classic populist remarks I know. And historically, the United States has seen populist movements before, starting at the end of the 19th century, when you had the great movement for free silver, with the closing of the frontier and trouble in the prairie. A whole lot of people in Nevada got it into their head that the real reason for the troubles in the American economy was the fact that America had moved away from a silver standard to a gold standard, and that the crucial thing was to have free silver. So we have William Jennings Bryan running for President of the United States on the populist ticket. And he was a classic populist. Again, he goes to Nevada and he says, I have heard the people. They are for free silver. Therefore, I am for free silver. And I will look up the arguments for it when I get back to my office. So, this is what populism is all about, but it often includes the kind of issues which I've been talking about, that is ressentiment, hatred of foreigners, anti-Semitism, all these other kind of things. There's a great variety of populists, but if they're going to achieve power, they have to come in a coalition. And different brands of populism will unite and exist side by side. So, that, I think, is what we are seeing with the Trump phenomenon. And there are some classic things, not just about uniting the people, but Trump wanting to deal with the flag burners. An issue which goes right the way back to the protests against the Vietnam War. But flag burning was an assault on the honor of ordinary Americans. And so should be punished even now when people are not burning American flags. So, that is my take on